Gentlemen, I certainly want to thank you for taking time out of a terribly busy schedule to talk with us this evening. I know that the entire country, and certainly the President of the United States and some congressmen, would like to know about the plans for a march on Washington. Mr. Wilkins, would you like to tell us what are the plans as of this date?
The plan is for a huge march to the Lincoln Memorial and a meeting there. On the way, what was described as a brief demonstration at the White House. But we hope to have this an outpouring of expression on the part of the people who wish Congress and the nation to know how they feel, how very deeply they feel about civil rights legislation. I think it's fair to say, wouldn't you say, Martin, that this is no attempt to blackjack anybody. We want to show how we feel.
Exactly. We are not going to Washington to intimidate any congressman or any senator. It will give a large number of people an opportunity to articulate their longings and aspirations for freedom, their desire to see meaningful, forthright civil rights legislation in this session of Congress. And of course, we also intend to arouse the conscience of the nation over the economic plight of the Negro 100 years after emancipation. And I think it can have a great impact. I think it will dramatize the issue. It will have educational value in that it will allow many people to see and understand the continued indignities and injustices which Negroes confront all over the nation.
All over the country, it has captured the imagination of hundreds of thousands of people. Now, we don't know how many of them will be marching to Washington, but a goodly number will. They feel keenly about this, and they want the seat of government. They want the American conscience to know how they feel.
You're aware that the President has cautioned that he would just as soon have the march postponed or not occur.
We see this as an all-inclusive demonstration of our belief in the President's program, and since it has been declared to be an orderly demonstration with a rally, at which time I hope to be one of the people who will speak in the interest of the Urban League toward preparing people for the new opportunities. At this level, we will be cooperating.
I think it's important that the march go off because there is legislation which many people have gone to jail for the substance. That is, the lunch counter demonstrations throughout the South have to be sort of brought to some climax, and it could be done in this public accommodations bill, which is before the Congress. Then, of course, it just left the Delta and a lot of poor people over there, people who make $2.25 a day for 12 hours of work. And so some legislation has to come out of the Congress of the United States to deal with these problems.
People like Agnes Myers, Roy, president of the board of the NAACP, and other white liberals and friends have cautioned against having a major demonstration for civil rights this summer. How do you...
Well, it's our position in the NAACP that the opponents of civil rights legislation left no doubt as soon as the president spoke. In fact, they didn't wait for him to speak. They began announcing their opposition and what they intended to do. They were going to filibuster, they were going to hold up appropriation measures, they were scaring the country that they weren't going to get a tax cut on account of civil rights. They're doing all the boogeyman stunts. And if they're going to use Washington as their base of operations for opposition to this bill, we don't see anything wrong with using Washington as our base to indicate support for this bill. And in my estimation, this march is going to be a 100% outpouring of the disgust and distress of black Americans and white liberals over the way the Congress has handled this bill.
I think that in any such demonstration as the march, which is planned, you will expect loud outpouring of cries of fears from many, many people who don't want it to take place, who are afraid that something might happen. But it seems to me that it reflects a lack of understanding of the nature of the times in which we are living. The fact that Negroes all over the country are concerned and are aroused and must express their feeling. They've waited 100 years, and that's too long to wait.
But what about white friends and liberals who have worked in these organizations for many years, who now say, look, let's not go this fast. Let's not...
we don't have people like that. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Our telephone is ringing with white people who want to get into the march.
We don't judge our friends on the basis of the color of their skin. We judge them on the basis of the fact of whether or not they are willing to go all the way with us. If they are not willing to go all the way, then they are not friends of ours.
Now, we've said that these are interracial organizations, but you five gentlemen are Negroes. You are assuming the leadership, and you are asking white liberals and white friends to go along with the Negro speaking for himself rather than speaking through white surrogates.
I would like to make this point because I think there is a misconception that any white people who happen to serve on your boards or committees are therefore automatically there to exercise control and restraint.
Yeah.
This is not the experience of the Urban League. There are many white people who serve on our boards who are asking for more militancy. I speak for the National Urban League at their insistence, not at my demanding, because they feel that a Negro is best able to express the hopes and the longings of his people.
We ought to be clear that there is a desire on the part of Negroes for self-expression through leadership of civil rights organizations. This is important because Negroes have been denied that self-expression for so many years. But this does not mean, in any sense of the word, as far as I'm concerned, that white persons who are sincere cannot participate and cooperate.
Exactly.
And I think it's very important to have this participation. I think it would be very dangerous and even tragic if the struggle in the United States for civil rights degenerated to a racial struggle of blacks against whites, so to speak.
Amen.
It is a tension between justice and injustice, and we enlist consciences in the struggle. We appreciate the participation in this movement of white persons of goodwill, and we have many of them, fortunately, and I think the number's growing every day, and this helps to keep the struggle on the level that it should be on.
Sure. As far as I can understand you gentlemen, this is not a racist march. This is a march of aroused Americans who want to demonstrate and assume their rights to petition their
And
Congress
want to witness.
and witness and support the president's civil rights legislation. The Attorney General would seem to disagree with you in terms of his testimony for Congress. He says that the most disturbing thing for Negroes is the public accommodation segregation.
The truth of the thing is that it's a vicious circle. Unless people are adequately educated, they can't possibly find good jobs. And unless people can find good jobs, they can't buy good housing, which puts them in good neighborhoods where they can get a good education. So instead of being one major thing, it's a group of things.
Yes, that's true, but it seems to me, of course, that the public accommodations matter, which is now being batted around in the Senate Commerce Committee, is the most abrasive and pervasive of the aspects of a Negro's life. Every time he steps out of his front door in the morning until he comes home at night, he runs the risk, and some of them don't run the risk, they run the certainty of this kind of denial and humiliation and mistreatment. And sometimes in the South, as you well know, in many subtle ways, you walk into a store and you're ahead of you're the next one to be waited on, but three white people come up and they get waited on first. This is a matter, Negroes meet this. In many places they would have to ride on the back of the bus. And they do want a Coca-Cola and can't get it. Now these seem small things, but then I think the Attorney General was talking about the things that rub people the wrong way and make them say, oh, let's get rid of it, you know.
And, you know, there are other areas of life which are very subtle, but which are not even being covered in the bill. And then there's some pronounced ways. I'm just thinking of the fact that you drive through the South, In some states, you can't even stop at the restrooms, and this is humiliating to women, you know, and it's very...
And of course, uncomfortable.
Well, it's very uncomfortable, but it's one of these little daily things. But I think that there are two areas that should be covered, you know, and that's the question of the voting bill. I don't see why we can't have universal suffrage for all Negroes. I mean, I really don't see why it has to be just a sixth grade educational level, because that's a device, and I think we were talking beforehand about how many people would be covered.
The Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is putting a great deal of its effort on voting, isn't it?
Yeah, well, we have a great program down, I think, in the Delta of Mississippi, but Roy might want to amplify on just how many people would be covered by a sixth grade education.
Well, the literacy test bill,
Yes.
you know, we agreed, well, we estimated, we couldn't, that not more than 100,000 Negroes would be added to the rolls under the literacy test. This is, Martin, you remarked on the number of people who didn't have a sixth grade education in one state. For 58%, I think it was, in Louisiana.
We testified before the House and suggested universal suffrage. I mean, there's just no reason why a person is not 21, he can't vote. He can go into the Army whether he can read or write. So why shouldn't he be able to vote?
And this is no sign that the person isn't intelligent, that the person doesn't have some basic intelligence. But because of discrimination and other conditions, many of these people haven't had an opportunity to get an education, and I think they should have the right to vote, and this is very basic.
No president has recommended a bill of this scope before, regardless of how we who suffer may feel its limitations, and I think we ought to work with that. Dangerous, as Jim has said, Jim Farmer has said, to pick out priorities, and because the opposition will start concentrating on your target. They say, well, what do you think is the number one? And this is, we have to avoid.
Roy, you made the point that no president in certainly my lifetime has made this kind of civil rights recommendation to Congress. Why do you think President Kennedy did this?
He did it because a crisis was created that demanded the attention of the nation on the highest level. Just like, well, a dust bowl is something beyond the state and beyond the region and demands federal action. A great disaster like Texas City demands national action. A great flood demands national action. And here we have a crisis in human rights brought about by one of the, in great part, by all of us, of course, but triggered by a man who sits around this table. And I think there's no doubt that Birmingham dramatized and brought into focus what Martin Luther King and his associates did in Birmingham, made it, the nation realize that at last the crisis had arrived.
It's necessary, it seems to me, and I just like to throw this out, to keep a considerable amount of pressure on. I mean, that is, a Negro does not, say in Mississippi, for instance, he has no constitutional means, that is, Eastland does not represent him, to achieve some solution, and this has to come from the government, or either he simply has to demonstrate. In other words, segregation may be like a piece of old iron, you put it in the fire to heat it up. And that so that people outside of Mississippi have to become conscious of what is going on there. For instance, there are 45 people in jail right now whose trials were held today for simply being at a voter registration meeting, and someone threw a smoke bomb in the church, and they marched down to the Justice of the Peace office to protest, or rather to the deputy sheriff, and they were arrested for disturbing the peace. And these are old ladies, some of them 75 years old, but yet they want to stay in jail.
The people that have the vote don't realize how much they could do by writing a letter.
That's right.
A congressman said to me, I have 8 letters on civil rights. 8 from his district. 8. And 5 of those were from white people. Now, you don't have to write a polemic. You just have to write a postcard saying, please vote for the Civil Rights Bill.
In traveling around the country, however, I hear many people make utterances which seem to indicate that they think the millennium will have arrived after we get civil rights legislation. That is not the case. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Even if we get the entire package that the president asked, plus various of the other good bills that are pending before Congress, A good legislation does not automatically enforce itself. We then have a problem of seeing to it that it is enforced in town after town, city after city, and only the will of the people will bring about the enforcement.
I would like to say that I have faith that the American people today are sufficiently convinced of the determination of Negroes to be truly free and the rightness of that aspiration, that I will be terribly disappointed if there is not a tremendous amount of support from all people for this legislation. But I would agree with Jim Farmer that this will just be, to me, the beginning. It's sometimes a lot easier to get people to walk a picket line than to walk to the library, or to get people to participate, parents to demonstrate, than it is to go to PTA meetings.
One of the heartening things about this aroused conscience that Martin spoke of a moment ago is the unprecedented activity of the organized faiths, the organized religious faiths. Yes. I think we're going places on this, but I'd like to put in a little sour note here. And I get some mail that I can't read on television, that I can't exhibit, and the postmaster delivers like this, holding it up by the people who say that Negroes ought to go back to Africa, and you're only apes anyway, and you think we're going to give you a civil rights bill, you're crazy, and we'll run you in the Mississippi River first, and a whole lot of other uncomplimentary things.
I'm really more concerned about the so-called gentle people of prejudice. The people who will say, I'm with you, I am for you, but what about property values, you know, and the man's right to run his business, and what about standards of the school being lowered? And so for these reasons, who would say, well, maybe you shouldn't have all of this right now. These are the people I'm really concerned about.
May I comment on that? I agree with you completely. While I share Roy's concern about the extreme bigots, I'm far more concerned about the good, the decent people who don't throw a bomb as they do in Birmingham or other places in the South, but they quietly pack their bags and move away. And this, it seems to me, is more damaging to our cause and more dangerous to the total cause of integration.
I have an answer for you, gentlemen, but go ahead.
Yeah, I guess, well, I'm concerned about the one in between going back to Africa and moving away, and that's basically the public officials, you see, who inflict all of this brutality, because the millennium is not going to come, primarily because we have no laws to deal with police brutality in the South, which I think is a fundamental issue in this whole thing.
Jim, I suppose you are very conscious of this because your membership is on the firing line, and
yeah, and I've seen
daily
people,
the victims of police.
Dr. King just came from Danville, and over a month ago we saw 35 people with holes in their heads as big as a ashtray, inflicted by the police. And nothing has been done about it. And the government, it seems to me, ought to do something about this.
What specifically would you suggest for dealing with this?
Well, I would suggest, you see, that the government go in and file some suits. When the constitutional rights of a person is denied, the government ought to file a suit in behalf of that person. I think this gets back to Part 3.
That's right.
Now, the government says that the existing laws are inadequate, but yet they're not asking, or it is not asking, for adequate laws in this legislation.
I think the only thing that changes the mind of a policeman like that is to sue him and to convict him and to convince him that the Constitution has some control over that billy club he has in his hand.
Is there anyone who is planning to do this? Roy?
Well, now we're entering into one of the most difficult areas of civil rights, because the whole area of convicting a policeman for depriving a man of his civil rights has to be proved down to the last period and comma. Not only that, his intent has to be proved.
Jim?
Yes, I think we have an additional weapon, and that is the ballot.
Yes.
The vote, and which is why all of us here are pushing a voter registration drive. If Negroes are registered in large numbers down there in Greenwood, then the police, of course, will take a different point of view. And in Danville also.
Exactly.
Because they'll know then that they have to be responsible and responsive not only to white voters, but to Negro voters as well.
White people in the South and in the North need education on this matter. I don't mean education on humanity as to Negroes, but they need education on the constitutional rights of Negroes and on the fact that he's a citizen. He's been here 344 years, and to hear some of them talk they'd say, look what we're doing for you people.
If you've never been in Mississippi, and Roy was born, and I just have to get back because
you were born
I
in
think I have to
My
just try
father
to
was born there.
help. Well, I'm sorry, your family was. I was raised down there, and I want to talk about these people. See, I think the president ought to go through Mississippi because I don't think he has any conception, any visual conception. Intellectually, he knows the suffering that's going on there. But just to see some of these shacks that people are living in, it's frightening in a sense, down in Itabena. It's just a very depraved area.
Itabena?
Yeah.
I've been to Itabena.
Isn't it a depraved?
Oh, it's really
it's
something.
pitiful.
Well, I think what we need to get at here is if we could get the total society to somehow lose this making a god of state rights and begin to see citizens as national citizens.
Right.
Because what's actually happened in this country is much of the miseducation, lack of education altogether, much of the social disorganization we see in the North that concerns us can directly be traced back to the indifference of the people in the North to the problems of the South. Right. These people later become the welfare load, the crime rate of the North. If we had adopted the concept of a citizen in Mississippi being a citizen of the United States,
that's right,
then we would have avoided all these problems.
Yes.
That's the way they're seen overseas.
That's right.
I think the president ought not only look at the housing in Mississippi, he ought to look at the slum tenements in Harlem and in 100 Harlems across the country. Indeed, we might say that our people are not only being bitten by dogs in Birmingham, Reverend King, but by the rats in the slum tenements.
Well, aren't we saying, gentlemen, that a program has not yet been worked out to grapple with the magnitude of this problem in the United States, both North and South?
It's
And
not regional.
You're so right.
isn't there a need now, because of the urgency and the seriousness of the situation, to develop a sort of crash program to lift the standards of the Negro and to get rid of the underlying conditions that produce so many social evils and develop so many social problems? I think this is what we face at this time, and I know it leads to the whole question of discrimination in reverse and all of that. But I think we've got to face the fact in this country that because of the legacy of slavery and segregation and the seeds of injustice planted in the past, that we have this harvest of confusion now, and we're going to continue to have it until we get to the root of the problem.
Well, that's that root and the rats go together.
Yeah.
The announcement of the Real Estate Brokers Association some time ago advising their members not to pay any attention to fair housing laws, that property rights still came first. And when you think of the billions of dollars in this country tied up in real estate, there isn't much that the President of the United States could do by going and looking at some slums, let's be fair.
Yeah, well,
The real power and obstacle there is the property right structure in this country, which isn't concerned with how many kids are bitten by rats or how many people live in slums.
Most of you recall that we did announce recently, our board adopted this domestic Marshall Plan, and this was consciously given this name because, if you recall, this country has spent some $12 billion on rehabilitation of Europe, war-torn Europe. In a 4-year period, we have spent millions on refugees from Cuba and from Hungary. We spent all kinds of money giving free education to veterans after the war and making it possible for them to buy homes. I think the time has come for us to honestly face up to the fact that this tremendous gap due to historical deprivation that the Negro has suffered will not be closed not quickly enough unless we consciously and deliberately establish programs that call not just for equal schools, but better schools and better teachers and provisions for housing and conscious recruiting at the level of employment. This has to be done in order to get rid of what I see too much of, and that is the feeling of despair and hopelessness.
I think that Negroes have had special treatment in this country for 350 years, special treatment of a negative sort.
That's right.
Now what Whitney and the rest of us are asking for is some special treatment of a
And
positive sort to wipe out that gap.
Are you united in this, or is there any...
Well, I want to be
Yes,
understood
we
on
are.
it.
But I'm not asking people to hire people who aren't qualified.
And we're
But
not
you're
asking
asking-
them to skip over white people or to deny white people their chance, but we're saying that just giving the Negro an equal break
not enough.
is not enough.
I wonder,
Across the
gentlemen, if
board.
you're in asking for this special break, you're not asking for a special break for the nation rather than just for the Negro.
Oh,
it will
indeed.
be.
Very
Look,
definitely.
if this country doesn't, if this doesn't, they don't solve the human rights problem of the Negro.
Right.
The manpower problem
This
is-
country morally is sunk.
Not only
Absolutely.
Well, what about
Not only morally.
practical manpower,
Well,
human resources?
they've been suffering from manpower all along, and I anticipate what Jim's going to say. Not only morally sunk, but they'll be sunk.
they'll be sunk economically,
You
too.
see.
Economically, politically, and morally.
The President's Council of Economic Advisors said some months ago that discrimination in jobs against Negroes costs the country something like $13 billion a year.
If you gentlemen are correct that it cannot survive without instituting justice,
Well, it can't.
is it possible that the society will choose not to survive rather than to...
Not consciously.
Not consciously.
Not consciously.
Well,
No, I seem to sense that increasingly more people are beginning to see integration as an opportunity and not just a problem. The fact
are
that we
these only articulate people, though? Are these
No,
only
I-
the people to whom you talk? What
there are
about the
some
masses of American whites? Could it be that they are so conditioned to hate Negroes
No.
that they would rather see the society go under rather than to provide...
well,
It's
I
not
don't-
the
I don't
masses.
think
Politicians might articulate
No,
this.
the average white person in this country doesn't want to see his country go under rather than give a fair deal to the Negro. He believes in a fair deal, but he also wants to protect
Well,
himself and his job, and I don't blame him.
I have read a number of writers on this, and the most eloquent of the writers seem to me to be Mr. Baldwin. And if I read underneath his lines, there seems to be a deep sense that maybe the American white man is not prepared for survival and justice. But as I listen to you gentlemen talk, you do seem much more optimistic than this, Jim.
Well, Kenneth, I would not go so far as to say that the American white man is prepared not to survive in order to avoid giving Negroes equal rights. But I will say that I would not be prepared at the moment to put our cause to a general referendum in this country.
No.
I don't think we'd win it.
I don't think civil rights are negotiable.
I think I could almost predict what the figure would be.
Of course.
2-1 against you.
I'm sure it would be.
Well, isn't it true that we're grappling with a problem that constantly emerges in history, that you have a few people who are crusaders in the right direction. You always have a few people who are crusaders in the wrong direction. And the vast majority are out there in the middle somewhere, with a great deal of apathy and complacency. And I think we have this in our country today. The vast majority of people are not active integrationists or active segregationists. They are passive adherents to the status quo.
But
And
they
I
have
think
been
the
socialized
job,
in a
yes.
society in which racism is dominant.
I agree, and I think the job here is for the creative minority to work on this large group, because I think these people are pliable to the legitimate and just demands of the Negro. And I do not choose to follow the path of despair, because I think that there is a way out, even though we do have to face the problems that have developed and the conditioning that has developed as a result of this problem existing a long time. But I do think there is a way out, and I think that with the creative minority standing up with determination to solve this problem, we can solve it.
Whenever the American people have been faced with a crisis, they've come through. Now, they may have come through in ragged and bloody fashion, but they've come through. And I'm convinced that they'll come through this one, even though it involves very deep-seated emotions. I think they're going to solve it.
I've always had the feeling that one of the major problems was that the average white citizen somehow drew a correlation between status and exclusiveness, and in many cases racial exclusiveness, so that the more exclusive the neighborhood, the school, the place of employment, the higher his status. Now, I think...
But he's been taught not to like you either.
Yes,
and
but
not
now...
to like you because of the color of your skin.
Yes, but now he must be taught that this is a sign of his basic insecurity, that for years, as Baldwin put it, he has had a reason, a need to feel superior. Now we must change the norm and get people to understand that it is insecurity that makes you want to take advantage and to hate, that only the secure people now can move toward inclusiveness. It is the more intelligent, the more mature people who want this kind of thing, and only the tragically insecure need today to surround themselves with sameness.
Gentlemen, I certainly want to thank you for what certainly is the most stimulating and to me quite instructive discussion. I think that America is indeed fortunate to have men of your breadth, your perspective, your sense of responsibility and intelligence as the leaders of probably the most significant social revolution since the 18th century. It certainly is my personal opinion that you 5 men are the contemporary versions of our founding fathers who risked so much and dared so much for freedom and liberty.